Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am Jeff Forster with Minnesota Lakes and Rivers, and we have Jim Chamberlain with us. Jim, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Jim Chamberlain. I work with Happy Dancing Turtle, which is a nonprofit located in Pine River, Minnesota. We have a broad sustainability issue and work to support sustainability and growing good stewards is the term we like to use. I am a supervisor for Crow Wing Soil and Water Conservation District and past employee there. And yeah, my wife and I own a farm east of Brainerd, about 12 miles.
And Jim and I met through Pine River Watershed. They were working on their One Watershed, One Plan. And one of the biggest pieces of protecting water in uh, Minnesota, certainly in the country, but in Minnesota in particular, is agricultural runoff. But we need food. So Jim and some other farmers are working on regenerative agriculture as kind of a broad uh, term that covers a lot of different practices. And then specifically 5 soil health principles. And what practicing these soil health principles does is increase the infiltration rate of rainwater on fields so it doesn't run off, it goes into the ground, meaning it's available for drought. It isn't in the ditch, it's not carrying chemicals and soil and all that into the lakes. And eventually, from the farmers I've been talking about, their yields start coming back up as the soil gets healthier, increases diversity, and Jim will talk a lot about all of those things. I've been fascinated meeting Jim and some of these other farmers. You get out on these fields and you walk, and the ground feels different. It looks different. It smells different. You see different animals, insects. It's uh, it's really something. And one of the things MLR is working on this year is with Jim, Happy Dancing Turtle, kind of. Uh, we're calling it. It was a program that Happy Dancing Turtle had called Up the Creek Meets, MEATS. And what we're doing is connecting lake associations with farmers in their watershed or in their area that practice soil health principles. So if you want to protect your lake, buy your groceries, your meat, your vegetables from one of these farmers. Can people, if you see a little bit of, I should have asked you this earlier. You see the emojis at the top. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me and everybody's on uh, without a problem. Oh, okay, I see that. And then you'll see the chat, and I'll be my title as Jeff is I am executive director of Minnesota Lakes and Rivers Advocates. We are a nonprofit that works with lake associations, individual lake people. Our mission is to protect Minnesota's lake and river heritage by forging powerful links among lakes, lake advocates, and policymakers. And so this effort to link farmers and agriculture with lake advocates is very much in our mission, and it's kind of what we do. Um, and I see there's one chat here already. Okay, yeah, I answered that. Jake Nimrod. So do you want me to start the PowerPoint here for you, Jim?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just so everybody knows, we had trouble getting that loaded today, so I'm just going to have Jeff advance the slides for me. And
Yeah, we've been having some hold on a second here.
so Jeff did such a good introduction. I think I'm done, and I can just open it up to questions, maybe. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Let me see if I can get this.
I could go ahead and start while you try to get that loaded.
Okay.
So I guess a little more on my history. I like to say that I like to start with the first blue ribbon I got at the Anoka County Fair at the age of 10 for a vegetable display. I've been growing food for most of my life. Um, in the mid 80s, I got interested in, I had some health issues and I got concerned with my food. I had a mentor down the road, a neighbor from the 1960s generation that kind of steered me down the organic path. I got my first subscription to organic gardening in 1986. Went back to school in the early 90s as a non-traditional student in my early 30s to try to better understand this and understand our food system and how we can grow food without harming those resources. And been on that kick kind of ever since. It's been pretty exciting the last 10 years or so to see some of the changes going on in agriculture, some of the positive changes going on in agriculture, albeit they seem somewhat slow at times.
Can you see the screen, Jim? Is
Yes,
your
I
PowerPoint?
can.
You can. Okay.
Yep. Um, yeah, and the caption that I used here is restorative agriculture to heal our soil and water. I just that I like that term heal. And it starts. It's the one action we can take as citizens is the what we put in our mouth and how that affects our wellness as well as the wellness of our planet and our water and everything else. The picture that is on the screen in the photo is a picture of Laguna Blanca farm in Argentina. It was owned by the late Doug Tompkins, who was the founder of North Face, and Doug Tompkins felt that you should be able to grow food and not harm the environment, and he had the belief that agriculture done right was land art, is what he referred to it. It should be beautiful. Um, and I have no idea if this photo is doctored or not, but photoshopped. But if you, I think this PowerPoint's going to be posted later. So that Laguna Blanca, there's a link there to a 20-minute video about his farm, which is a pretty inspirational watch if you get a chance to look at that. Otherwise, you can just Google Laguna Blanca, Argentina, and find the video. Next slide, please.
Okay.
So I'm going to talk briefly about soil health and why that is important. No, back one. Back. Too far. It's just right there. And then I'll get into the soil health principles and talk more about those solutions and the benefits to implementing soil health principles, as well as what citizens can do to help support those efforts of farmers. So what is soil health? Like I mentioned, I've been in this discovery stage for a long time, and the introduction of the Soil Health Initiative by the Natural Resource Conservation Service 10 years ago or so to start this Soil Health Initiative has been pretty inspirational. And I guess the definition they use that you can see there, they recognize soil as a vital living ecosystem, which agriculture hasn't done in the past. The important thing there is the capacity of soil to function, and function is defined as the ability to cycle nutrients in water. The biology in the soil is what cycles those nutrients and makes them available to plants. And like Jeff mentioned earlier, the function of the restoring that water cycle, being able to infiltrate water and hold it in the soil profile and purify it and clean it on the landscape. So this caption on the right that says, if you want to make small changes, change the way you do things. If you want to make large changes, change the way you see things. I'm not exactly sure who that quote is attributed to, but I've heard some of my heroes in the sustainable ag world, like Gabe Brown and Ray Archuleta, used this comment before. And I guess my story that I have that goes along with that is a local farmer from Palisade, Minnesota, um, Roger Volt with Gun Lake Potato Farm, who just recently retired because of he aged out, which a lot of our farmers are doing. But he raised potatoes for 35 years, and about 20 years into his potato growing career, he decided that he wanted to cut back on chemicals, and he got a hold of a subscription of Acres USA, which is an ecological farming magazine out of Missouri. They've been around since the 1970s. And he started changing the way he did things and started cutting back on his chemicals and extending his crop rotation. And a couple, 3 years into that, the story he tells is that he woke up one morning and his whole field looked white, and he thought he had a really bad blight or fungus that had taken over his field overnight, and he couldn't understand it. So he put his boots on and went outside real quick. And what it was is it was spiderwebs shimmering in the field. And he had never seen that before in his 20 plus years of growing potatoes. He realized that was kind of his aha moment, that he had spent the last 20 years killing everything in his field. And this idea of how can you support life instead of just trying to control nature. And you hear that story over and over again. Next slide. So why soil health? Well, everybody here is advocates for our lakes and rivers, and one of the main reasons I believe we need to make our soil healthy is to keep our water clean. Increasing the health of soil increases organic matter, and increasing organic matter allows soil to hold more water on the landscape. That helps to reduce erosion, makes farming systems more resilient to extremes, extreme drought, extreme inundation, and most importantly, like I said, it restores the hydrology on the landscape. So when I first started, I spent 10 years at the Crow Wing Soil and Water Conservation District as a technician, and when I first started there in the late 90s and 2000, the Board of Water and Soil Resources came out with a study on the Minnesota River Basin and where the sediment was coming from in that basin. And basically what came out of that study is that they found that approximately 15% of the sediment in the Minnesota River was coming off of farm fields, and about 15% was coming off urban landscapes. The other 70% or so was coming from stream bank erosion. So I asked the director of the Board and Water Soil Resources when he gave his talk on that. I said, well, basically what we have is a hydrology issue. We have water leaving the land too fast. And he said, well, yeah, that's the problem. So 20 years later, 2019, last year, the Army Corps of Engineers released a study, $9.8 million multi-year, multi-agency study on the Minnesota River Valley. It basically came up with the same conclusion, that we have a hydrology issue. The amount of sediment coming out of stream bank and ditch erosion now is closer to 80% and not 70. So the issue has gotten the issue hasn't been addressed. It's gotten worse. So
Jim, yesterday it came up. People asked questions about a lot of the flooding that we're seeing of lakes in Minnesota. Is this related to that? Is some of the flooding, do you think, related to how we manage water on our landscape?
Well, we're seeing more temperature. We're seeing more weather extremes. The data is pointing to more extreme weather events, more rainfall in a shorter period of time, which is leading to some of those issues. But if you take that 1% organic matter at 25,000 gallons per acre, we've dramatically reduced the organic matter in our agricultural landscapes over the decades. And the one farmer I've run the math on is Gabe Brown in Burleigh County, North Dakota. He's increased his organic matter on his fields an average of 4% on 2,400 acres. And if you do the math on that, that's somewhere around 17. Now I'm forgetting what it was. Was it 17 or I think it was 17 acre or 170 acre feet of water that he can, additional water that he can hold on his land. Yeah, it was 170 acre feet of additional water that he can hold on his landscape compared to when he started farming it in the late 1990s. So
Wow.
that's a 10-foot deep lake, 17-acre lake, 10 feet deep that he's holding on his landscape that would have run off before.
Right.
Next slide. Another reason that I think soil health is important is anhydrous ammonia and our use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers in particular. Overuse of fertilizers in general, but in particular the nitrogen, the synthetic-based nitrogen. It's inherently bad, harmful to soil. The anhydrous ammonia was developed during World War II as a war weapon, as a bomb. It was the bomb that blew up the Oklahoma Federal Trade Building back in the 1990s, whatever it was. It has a crossbone and skull on its label. It was used in Vietnam to kill the soil and make it hard in the jungles, and we dump it on our agricultural landscapes by the trainload. It contributes to atmospheric off-gassing of nitric oxide, which is some 160 times more potent of a greenhouse gas than carbon. About 30% of nitrogen that's applied, at a minimum, 30% of the nitrogen that's applied to our agricultural landscapes is either off-gassed as nitric oxide or it leaches into our groundwater. It's basically inputs that farmers pay for that is lost to our environment and causes damage. Biological nitrogen, on the other hand, is stable and it doesn't leach. It's created by the biology in the soil. It extracts nitrogen from the air and helps to build soil aggregate and good soil structure to increase the water holding capacity and the biological life. Next slide. So how does the soil do that? How does the soil do that? How does it function? How does it make that natural biological nitrogen and other nutrients available? Most of that happens through the rhizosphere, which is that very small area around the root of a plant that has the most biological activity. This is not new science. In 1904, Lorenz Hentler wrote about it. These microorganisms influenced by chemicals released from the plant roots. Dr. Elaine Ingham refers to it as plant snot, but approximately 30 to 35% of the photosynthate that a plant produces, the exudate that it creates as a building block of the plant itself, it extrudes this about 30% of that out of the roots of the plant. And it does that to feed the biology. And the way Dr. Elaine Ingham describes it is that the smallest organisms in the rhizosphere, primarily bacteria, feed on those carbohydrates and those sugars that the plant is releasing, that plant snot, the plant exudate. And in turn, those organisms are eaten by larger organisms. And when the organisms either defecate or die, they release minerals and nutrients in the right balance and the right form that plant needs for optimum growth. About 85 to 90% of all soil fertility is through the biology, through those living organisms. Even in a conventional farm system that's dependent on synthetic nitrogen, it's a biological process. When they apply that nitrogen to the soil, it triggers bacteria to multiply on countless times over. And when those bacteria multiply, they eat organic matter. They consume organic matter. Then when they die off, they provide the nitrogen to the plant. This happens in a relatively short period of time, weeks or a month or months, not years. And it starts a vicious cycle. So those microorganisms that can handle those degraded soils and those the degraded soil structure, low oxygen conditions, low periods of inundation or dry periods, though they're very specific microorganisms. They're really limited in diversity, and they wait for their next fix of anhydrous ammonia, their next meth fix to multiply, consume organic matter, and then die off and supply the plant. So what we're trying to do is build the system to do that, so we don't have to rely on artificial chemicals to support our plant growth. I think that's all I had on that slide. Okay, you can move forward. You know, back again to this not being new information. Sir Robert Howard in 1934, in his publication Law of Return, spoke of this fungus that plants use to communicate with each other, and how this symbiosis with this fungus would make plants healthier. Nobody believed him. They dismissed it as magic. But we've known for 30 plus years that this mycorrhizae fungi, these tubular structures that you see in the photo here, can reach out into soil and drill into rock and extract phosphorus in an unusable form and change it to a usable form and feed it to plants. Every soil test I saw when I worked at the Soil and Water Conservation District called for more phosphorus, even though there was enough phosphorus in the soil to more than enough grow the crop they wanted. It just wasn't available, so the recommendation was to add phosphorus. We know that mycorrhizae can take that phosphorus in an unusable form, convert it to a usable form, and feed it to the plant. In return, the mycorrhizae gets photosynthate from the plant, which it turns into a substance called globulin, which is a humus-like substance that helps build soil structure and glue soil together and form good aggregation. Tree to Shining Tree, there's a link there to a podcast by Radiolab. Dr. Susan Samerd is a microbiologist, and she does an amazing job of talking about the magical mycorrhizae fungi. Next slide. So now we'll get into the soil health principles. I guess I got to go back to the mycorrhizae for 1 second. The mycorrhizae actually, in this symbiosis, I didn't mention this, in this symbiosis, the mycorrhizae actually attaches to the plant root. In some cases, it drills into the side, inside the plant root, actually enters the plant root to make this exchange, and other times it wraps around the outside and forms like a glove around the plant root to make these chemical exchanges. I didn't know if I made that clear, so I figured I better clear it up. And go back to the next slide. So the soil health principles, I just want to start here by saying that these are 5 soil health principles that are widely recognized. They were started by the Natural Resource Conservation Service and some forward-thinking thinkers, some conservationists like Jay Fuhrer and Ray Archuleta and Rick Haney and some of those folks that were county soil cons, and they worked their way up and became state leaders and eventually brought this soil health initiative to the national level. But they're recognized by many organizations and agencies around the world. It doesn't matter where you go, these soil health principles apply. And I just think it's important that people realize that these are principles. If a farmer can do, or a gardener can hit these 3 or 4 of these soil health principles and do a very good job at them, they'll have healthy soil. It's not like you have to be perfect at all 5. And they're not rules, they're principles. And then a lot of times people want to start talking right away about cover crops, or, how do GMOs play into this, genetically modified organisms, different things like that. Cover crops are just a tool. They're not a soil health principle. They're a valuable tool to meet many of the soil health principles, but they're not a principle. They're just a tool, and people need to be reminded of that. Next slide. We'll start with the first one, which is minimize soil disturbance. Microorganisms in the soil are just like us. They have to have a good home to live in. Anytime you till or plow up a soil, you're breaking up that soil structure, that soil aggregate. You're opening it up to raindrop impacts and erosion. And you're destroying that home for those microorganisms. It's like a tornado hitting your house. If you get hit by a tornado once in your life, you're going to rebuild and you're probably going to be fine. If you get hit by a tornado 3 times in your life, that's going to cause a lot of havoc and a lot of chaos in your life. Microorganisms don't have anywhere to go, so they can't escape that kind of stuff. So some ways to get around that is no-till. These pictures that are on this slide here are of roller crimpers, these tools where the tractor is actually rolling down a cover crop of rye and interseeding soybeans directly into that cover. The roller crimper effectively kills the cover crop that was planted and forms a mulch so that it holds the weeds down. And then they're interseeding right into that. And then on the right, there's a smaller scale market garden size roller crimper. Innovations by farmers at all scales. And then herbicides and pesticides as a disturbance. We know that herbicides affect the soil microbiome as well as pesticides. But there's the give and take. Like, is it worse? Is it better to use a herbicide on a limited basis so that you can do a good job of no-tilling, or is it better to disc or cultivate your soil? There's give and take there. I don't know that we have any of the good answers other than less is better in any case. Less herbicide or less tillage, whatever you can do to make your system work. Minimize that disturbance to the soil organisms, to the soil structure, and the chemical balance in the soil. Next slide. Number 2 is soil armor. I was at a presentation in South Dakota a while back. I guess it was in Fargo. So, and there was a speaker there, Joshua Dukart, who is a conservationist with the Burleigh County Soil and Water Conservation District, and he was working there when all this soil health initiative first got started. And he tells a story that he was in the office one day, and Jay Fuhrer, the district manager, came in from the field, and he was all upset, and he started ranting about them calling it trash and litter and organic matter. And he said, you know, these are all derogatory names. They're all weak and bad, and this stuff's way too important for that. And he walked in his office and closed the door. And 5 minutes later, he came back out and he slammed his fist on the desk and he said, "We're calling it armor. It's that important. We need to armor that soil." And I don't know. When I heard Josh tell that story, it kind of struck home to me with being a past soil and water conservation district and working with people with that kind of passion. And it would have been cool to be a fly on the wall that day, I think. So the picture on the right here is a picture of the Happy Dancing Turtle garden with some leaf mulch on our raised beds. So any kind of dead or living material can serve as a mulch to protect that soil. The mulching and armor help stabilize soil temperatures, help hold moisture in the soil, and help prevent evaporation, and then prevent erosion. Next slide. Keeping living roots in the soil, and this goes back to that plant exudate that I talked about before. Without that plant exudate in the soil, those microorganisms don't have anything to feed on. So if your soil, the typical farm field has corn or soybean field has living roots for maybe 4 months out of the year, the rest of the year, those microorganisms don't have anything to feed on. They don't have food, so they can't survive. So keeping living roots in the soil is vital to keeping living, healthy soil. Next slide. The next one is increasing diversity in the agricultural landscapes. So different types of plants give off different types of plant exudate that attract different types of microorganisms. So the more diverse your crop system is, the more diverse your plants are above ground, the more diverse the microorganisms underneath the ground are going to be. Some of the things that I advocate for is a minimum of a 4-year crop rotation. I don't think you can really be effective in building soil health with anything less than a 4-year crop rotation. Companion planting, we do a lot on a small scale, and there's been some work on larger scale plantings on that. Incorporating perennials through agroforestry or other situations. The kernza that's coming out which is the perennial grain. And then multi-species cover crops are the best way to integrate diversity into an agricultural landscape by getting a cover crop that has, you know, upwards of 10 or 15, sometimes 30 some species in that cover crop can really fuel diversity and the biology in the soil. This picture on the right is a picture of a squash planting with a clover cover crop in it. We don't usually do single species cover crops anymore. We're usually doing at least 6 or 9. Next slide. So the last one, and I think one that we're here primarily to talk about today is integrating livestock, and you hear a lot of talk about it, about livestock being bad, and meat being bad for us with all the plant-based diets that we have, plant-based burgers and all the stuff going on now. But I think it's a very vital component of rebuilding soil health. We can build soil without integrating livestock, but it's a much slower process. Livestock is the biological driver behind soil health. Like the quote says there, science has yet to replicate what comes out the back end of a cow. And there's even evidence that the saliva from a grazing ruminant acts as a foliar feed on the grass and spurs its growth. That little guy in the center of the picture there, that little bug is a dung beetle. Dung beetles are the pinnacle of a good grazing system. They take and they roll the manure up and they drag it down into the ground and they lay their eggs in it for the next generation to feed on when the eggs hatch and provide the next generation of dung beetles. There's some 30 species of dung beetle native to Minnesota, and they're what every grassman strives for, is a good dung beetle population. Next slide. I would recommend, if you want to dive more into this need to why we need to graze, through the Sustainable Farming Association, I have a link here to a PowerPoint presentation by Stephen Plumford, who really does a good job of explaining why we need to have animals on the landscape, both ecologically and environmentally. And from a health aspect, humans have evolved to eat, ruminants evolved to eat, as grazing animals, to eat grass, and if we look at pre-settlement, the numbers of livestock or of animals on the ground in pre-settlement before European settlement, right now we have somewhere around 60 million cows in America, is my understanding, and look at the buffalo and the elk, and that doesn't account for the woodland caribou and everything else that was there, as well as the impact they had on the landscape with game trails and wallows, things like that provide escape cover and cover for small birds to dry off during very wet conditions. So supporting other kinds of wildlife as well when these livestock have these impacts on the landscape. Next slide. So how do we do it? This very simple slide basically tells the story. Take half, leave half. If you look at the numbers there, if you graze 50% or less of that grass, you will lose only 2 to 4% of the root. Once you hit 70%, you're losing 80% of your root, and that's all roots that have to be rebuilt and recovered. Yeah, it's that simple. And then next slide.
So, Jim, you're talking about height, right?
Yep, the height of the grass. If you take less than half of that sward off the top, if that cow hits that grass once and only takes half of it, you'll have very little to no root loss. And the recovery time before that plant can start to grow again is substantially reduced, and you increase your productivity of your landscape. You keep those living roots in the ground for those microorganisms to feed on. Next slide. As soon as that plant is grazed, it's going to start to regrow soon again. And when it starts to regrow, that new growth is going to be very succulent. So if the cows are left on long enough so that plant starts to regrow, they're going to come back and they're going to hit that grass again, and they're going to want to eat that grass that was already grazed. And those are the most desirable species. And over time, as you can see in this photo, the weeds get bypassed, and eventually the weeds can keep getting stronger and stronger while your more desirable plants get less and less prevalent on the landscape. Next slide. So grazing management, adaptive grazing management is a sliding scale. A minimum rotation of 7 days. It's part art, part science, but basically looking at the stocking density, how many pounds of animals you have on the landscape. The size of the paddock helps determine that. the stage of your forage growth, whether it's early in the spring or in the height of June when the forage is really growing fast, or late in the summer, or in the fall when you're trying to stockpile forage for the winter. And then what's your impact? Are you doing a really quick graze? You just want to hit it quick and get off, or do you want to hammer it down and try to get some legumes or something else established in the paddock, and using livestock as a tool that way. And then return interval, a minimum of 30 days before those animals return to the landscape. Some farmers or ranchers are shooting for a once a year graze on their paddocks. Next slide. And I think one of the biggest things we can do is integrate livestock into our cropping systems. If we want to get rid of the artificial fertilizers, we need livestock in our cropping systems to fuel that. The booklet on the left was put out by the University of Minnesota Regional Extension Regional Sustainable Development Partnership, and it showcases 9 farmers in southwest Minnesota that are implementing these soil health principles, and it explains what they're doing and what they see as successful, and what those impacts are both to the landscape and to their pocketbook. The picture on the upper right is a picture of cows grazing on a corn and oats and soybean oats and pea cover crop. That wasn't planted as a commercial crop. It was planted for those cows as forage or food for the cows. And then this bottom one is a picture from the Main Street project where they're grazing chickens underneath hybrid hazelnuts, of a cross between the European filbert and the American hazelnut to make them more productive. Chickens are a forest creature. They evolved in the forest, so pastured chicken is an oxymoron. We raise shady chickens is what we try to call them. Next slide. So some of the ecological restoration that can happen with regenerative agriculture, University of Minnesota Forever Green Initiative is looking at things like the kernza, which is a perennial wheat, and other things like the hybrid hazelnut, and how we can get those on the landscape and how they can be profitable for farmers. They have pennycress and other oilseed crops that they can overwinter and harvest in the spring and then plant the next crop afterwards. And then the Green Lands Blue Waters is a multi-state initiative, primarily of universities up and down the Minnesota River that are working to perennialize our agricultural landscapes. They want to turn 10% of our agricultural landscapes to perennial crops. The picture in the upper right is the Ecological Livestock Network with the Sustainable Farming Association, using goats and other animals other livestock to control invasive species. And then on the bottom is a picture of one of my heroes' farms, Mark Shepard, New Forest Farm, where he's implemented agroforestry on 107 acres of degraded cornfield back in the 1990s. He started this. He put in a system called keyline design. It's a permaculture concept that was developed in Australia, where you take water from the wetter valleys and you move it slowly across the slope in ditches and swales to the drier ridges. In the last 30 years, Mark's been able to create wetlands up the slope in this dry karst topography, well-drained karst topography, and years ago they had students out from Winona State University to do a bird count over the weekend, and they counted out, I believe it was 117 species of birds in a weekend on this working agricultural landscape. And there's something to be said about land art with that photo too, I believe. Next slide. We have the technology. We have Fitbits for cows. We have drones to keep an eye on them, which I don't know if I'm a big fan of. I think cows need to see people, but that's just me. It works for some people, I guess. Pasture Map app that you can draw your pastures and your paddocks and determine forage production and how much your stocking density should be in your paddock, and help keep track of those records. And then things like polypropylene wire electric fence that you can roll up on a reel, and solar fencers where you can install a quarter-mile of fence in 18 minutes, which would have took our grandparents, weeks, if not months, to put in a quarter-mile of fence. So we have technology to help that. and we need to use the appropriate technology. Next slide. Soil testing is moving forward. The Solvita test, trying to measure the biological activity in the soil. They've been doing soil respiration measurements since the 1860s, but only in the last couple decades have they got the science to really do it effectively and quickly and low cost. So now for $25 or $27, you can get a Solvita test, which will give you the respiration rate of your soil. So the organisms in the soil are just like us. They breathe in oxygen, give off carbon dioxide. And if you can measure that exchange rate, it gives you an idea of how alive your soil is and the biologically available nitrogen. The Haney test takes that a step further and looks at some of the carbon to nitrogen ratios and your the lipid fatty acids in the soil profile. Combines that with the soil respiration test of the Solvita and the current and past cropping systems and future cropping systems to give you an estimate of what your biologically available nitrogen and phosphorus are for that preceding crop. The picture on the right is a picture of a diagram of the Earth Microbiome project, where they did close to 30,000 samples around the world, 2 billion genetics sequences, and basically found that soils are by far the most diverse and complex microbiomes on our planet, and they're related. Soils on different continents are related to other soils by their microbiome. Pretty interesting stuff. I don't know that I understand much about it, but it's pretty interesting hearing about it anyway. Next slide. So why isn't this happening? I think I saw a question pop up here a while back about this. Some of it's knowledge. Farmers don't have this knowledge. Farmers have been told for years by crop consultants and universities and our government that we just need to measure the chemical balance in our soil and apply what the crop needs. Burlurg Hall at the University of Minnesota is named after Norman Borlaug, who championed that synthetic nitrogen in the 1940s and 50s. He did a lot of good work around plant breeding. I'm not saying that he didn't do any good work. I'm just saying that I think our philosophy was a little skewed. And then there's peer pressure. A farmer was telling a story a while back about a project, or that when he first started planting cover crops, he would go to the coffee shop and everybody would give him a hard time about the weeds in his field. And a few years later, when the price of corn dropped to under $3 a bushel, he was in the coffee shop and everybody was talking about how much money they were losing on their corn because it was costing $4, to grow it, and they were only getting $3 for it. And he finally spoke up and said, "Well, it cost me $2.40 to raise my corn, so I'm actually making 60 cents a bushel." And got kind of quiet, and then pretty soon somebody was like, "Well, how about them twins?" But a couple weeks later, one of the other farmers stopped by his field and caught him in the field one day and started asking him some questions. And then a month later, another farmer stopped by and started talking to him. And now he's got 2 or 3 farmers around him that are planting cover crops. It's a hard transition. Farmers have to learn that knowledge. They have to change their system. They got money invested in what they have right now and in the system that they have now. And it's hard. Change is hard. And then the understanding, this whole replacement theory, you have to, for years we've been told what you take out of the soil, what you harvest in a crop, you have to replace the nutrients of, and that's how we calculate a lot of that. And it comes to the logical fallacy is what I like to call it. In all the Leopold's book in Thinking Like a Mountain, he talks about the wolf and the fire dying in the green fire dying in the wolf's eyes. It goes, "I was young and full of trigger itch, and I thought that if fewer wolves meant more deer, that no wolves meant a hunter's paradise. But I could see as the fire died in the old wolf's eyes that neither the mountain nor the wolf agreed with this view." It's kind of the same thing. If we, it makes a lot of sense if you harvest so much nitrogen, if you harvest so much phosphorus off the soil that you have to replace that in the next crop, but it's not true. The biology in the soil will do that for us. And then how do we get that infrastructure back on the landscape and get the fencing systems and the water systems we need? and the labor to do that. I'm advocating for a conservation grazing corps similar to the civilian grazing corps in the 1930s. I think we have a crisis on our hands, and we need to address it. And then farmer to farmer knowledge. This is a picture of one of our field days where we were doing a silvopasture training through the Crow Wing River Basin Forage Council. Next slide.
Hey, Jim, how about developing markets for products that are raised in this way? Would that help accelerate the transition?
Next slide, please.
I'm
Yeah.
getting
So, this is something that, organic farming has been supported by the pocketbook. It's been customers coming and saying, "This is what I want." There hasn't been anybody advocating for sustainable agriculture back in the 1970s and 80s. It was consumers voting with their wallet. And we compete as sustainable farmers. We compete with the cheap food. We compete with the nitrogen-based cropping systems. And we've lost we've lost agriculture in the middle, and part of that is the processing and distribution that goes along with that, and local processing and local distribution. I think we're seeing some of that play out in the closing of some of these mega processing plants, like the Smithfield plant in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, that closed due to COVID. They produce some 40% of our pork in Minnesota. So at Happy Dancing Turtle, we've been working on that, and through the Pine River Watershed, we did a report with the Cass County Farm Bureau called Cows for Clean Water. This idea, how do we raise cows and how can we market product that was raised the right way and get that to the hands of the people that care? And Happy Dancing Turtle, we followed that up with this Up the Creek Meek study on local processing and a mobile slaughter unit in particular. I'm looking to follow that up. We got some funding through the Agriculture Utilization and Research Institute to take a deeper dive into that, specifically around consumer ownership of some kind of cooperatively owned processing facility. Next slide. So how do you get involved? I'm a big fan of knowing your farmer. If the farmer doesn't want you on his land, there's probably something he's doing that he maybe doesn't want you to see. Not always the case. Some farmers are just withdrawn and they don't want you there. But most of the regenerative farmers I know are proud of what they're doing, and they want you to come see their farm and see the work they're doing. And it's a big difference compared to some states have laws that make it felony if you falsify in your application to get into a confined animal feedlot to take pictures and distribute those. So it's a kind of a different story. So your local food co-ops are doing a good job of carrying these products. Farmers markets, you can look at Minnesota Grown, look for farm tours. There's all kinds of sustainable agricultural conferences like the Crow Wing River Basin Forage Council that's local here, and supported by the Whitefish Area Property Owners and the Pine River Watershed Alliance. Go figure out what farmers are. Go look at it from the farmer standpoint and what they need to go through to do this work and do it right. It takes more effort, and they need to be supported. And then know your food. The whole idea that grass-fed beef is healthier. Grass-fed, grass-finished ruminants have more omega-6s, I believe, versus 3, or maybe it's the other round, but they have the healthier fats. They evolved to eat grass and not grain. Talk to your grocery store and your local grocery store and say you want local meat in that store and you want to know how it's raised. And then talk to your congressman and tell them you want to see this type of stuff supported. And lastly, I guess, consider investing. Partner with a farmer. Look for initiatives that are trying to build these networks and build these systems again, and see how you can be involved in that. And then finally, Jeff talked briefly about this Up the Creek Meat CSA. So we're taking that idea of local meat, and we're going to try to work through lake associations at a pilot project to make that connection between producers and lakeshore owners and people concerned with water quality. Next slide.
One of the things I was going to bring up, Jim, was I think it was you that had the idea, but some lake associations are actually creating foundations to do, work on the lake, or maybe to buy land that's within their watershed to help improve water quality. And there could be an opportunity here for buying land that then can be leased out at a good rate to farmers doing this kind of work.
Right. And there's a
Um,
big push, especially among non-producer women landowners, women who own farmland and rent it out. There's a big push to that with different organizations to have more control over how that land is farmed. You know, make some demands, not demands, but work with your farmer and find farmers that are willing to raise crops the way you want to see it be raised, and then support them in that. Um, Plant a garden. Pollinator Habitat. There's grants out there through the Board of Water and Soil Resources to put in pollinator habitats and riparian buffers, those deep roots along our shorelines to infiltrate that water as it moves through the soil profile and clean it, pull out those nutrients and pollutants. Rain gardens, diversifying your lawn, and get kids involved. That's my grandson, Landon, with some of my garlic. He was good for about 20 minutes or a half hour, and then he got pretty sick of it. Next slide. And it works. This is photos from the Happy Dance. Well, the top one isn't this slide with the roots, but my Happy Dancing Turtle Garden. We built that garden in 2006. It was bare sand, and by applying soil health principles over the last 12 to 14 years. This is a over 6 pound head of cauliflower. The next week we harvested a 7 pound head of cauliflower. And then there's pretty nice onions that Dave's holding there, and our student and intern in the back there, Chase or Chance. He looks pretty proud of that crop. It looks like to me. So, and then seeing wildlife like snakes and different things in our garden is always really cool. And I think that's all I got, Jeff. Next slide, I think, is the last one. So I think I went a little over, but
let me get out of this here.
Go through some questions.
Yeah, and you can see the questions, Jim.
Yep, I think you got Jake's already. Caitlin, oh,
I don't have the capacity to do a public chat here, but we'll go through the questions, Caitlin.
Yep. Why are feedlots for cattle so popular when grazing animals sound so easy? Well, I think maybe later on in the presentation, Jim, that some of that was addressed. Oh, these are private, aren't they? So there was a question here, why are feedlots for cattle so popular when grazing sounds so easy? Well, I guess it's not really easy. You maybe got that from the rest of the presentation after I got further into it. There are a lot of barriers to accelerate rotational grazing on the landscape and integration of cows into our cropping systems. And then the Savita test and the Haney test, you can just Google those online and you should be able to find them. If not, get a hold of me and I can get you connected. The current dominant food farming system was used to replace native food systems as a tool of genocide. Indigenous people still have this knowledge, including Rehi of Main Street Project. Along with assuring the health of the land itself, we are seeing efforts to amplify living native knowledge and redistribute power in land for true regeneration. There's a book, I guess I'll just answer this with a comment. There's a book called Teachers in the Forest that was written by Barry Babcock, a professor at Bemidji State University, who spent 25 years living in the woods off the grid. And one of his mentors was Larry Stillday with the Red Lake Tribe. And in his book, Barry talks about the Native American land ethic and how that's very similar to the land ethic of Aldo Leopold. That everything is connected, that every cog in the wheel has a role to play, that kind of thing. We're all related in some way. Only the Native American the Native American approaches it from the spiritual side, where Aldo Leopold approaches it from the European science based approach. Yeah, you're right. We need to change the way we see things. Yeah, and how do you redistribute that power? People need to be involved.
I've been meeting farmers through Jim and interviewing them and talking to them and looking at articles that they send to me, and I forgot who it was, Jim, but somebody sent me an article about buffalo. And buffalo will graze spring grass down to the point where and then they'll stop. They won't take it all the way down to the ground. And the point at which they stop naturally is the point which stimulates the maximum root growth in the grass. And so, because of the way they graze, they actually increase the growth of the prairie plants that they're grazing on. And they do this naturally. And I think it was I won't remember which farmer said it to me, but he goes, oh, well, he goes, yeah, in native knowledge that these species evolve in this area. And so they evolve in a way that maximizes the landscape. A cow will take it right down to the ground. So basically, the humans got to get in there and chase them off that patch of land and lock them in another patch of land uh, so that the grass comes back at the right. But buffalo will just do it on their own if they have enough space to kind of
Right.
move around, you know,
If they have the options. Yeah.
which I thought was fascinating. So because I think with native cultures evolved in this ecosystem, um, reliant on these animals, that they had the same, they kind of evolved along with the buffalo. So they were also taking action that enhanced the environment rather than and increased productivity. I would love to see a study. You said 60 million cows, and let's say there were 60 million buffalo. I wonder if the land in America produced more calories of meat pre-settlement or post-settlement.
Yeah, I don't know. I think as a society we eat way too much meat.
Well, that's a
But
funny thing for a pork farmer to say.
yeah. Thomas Jefferson advocated for meat to be used as a condiment to flavor and enhance our vegetables. That's why I
Uh,
like bacon.
yeah, I like bacon.
Questions here, Jeff.
Any concerns with putting in a well near livestock? Can too much waste contaminate groundwater?
Sure, too much of anything is going to contaminate. Yeah, it's all about management and yeah, I mean, it comes to a point almost in every farmer's rancher's rotation where they don't have enough forage and they have to confine their livestock. They call that sacrificial paddocks because you know that you're going to ruin that area. You're going to degrade that site, so you confine them in an area, and you know that that's going to be the case. You just make sure that's not near groundwater, not near wells, and that you're controlling your runoff the best you can. Some farmers get away without that. And there's a farmer from southern Minnesota that was presenting at the Soil Health Summit um, that back in February, and they were still grazing. I guess it was March, but they were still grazing in March. He still had his animals on pasture, grazing stockpiled forage year round. Next one by Jake. Could you compare the effect of soil health on good soil practices versus the soil health of golf courses? Um, well, golf courses growing grass, golf courses or lawns is a different story. It's really hard to get diversity on a golf green, but they're doing some good work with compost teas and other biological stimulants on some golf courses. Being able to reduce the amount of nutrients that they're applying and fungicides and different things like that. I don't know a whole lot about it, but I know that some of that's going on. Taking those compost teas to build a tea of highly aerobic, highly oxygenated um, tea condition that supports the good bugs, the good bacteria, and multiplies their numbers and and then you apply those we can do it on anything, whether it's a lawn or a golf course or a farm field to stimulate that biology. So it is possible to reduce those chemical inputs on lawns and golf courses. Are lakes benefited more by being surrounded by trees or grass? I guess I don't know if I have a good answer for that. Yeah, I think it's whether you have healthy soil, whether you can infiltrate or not. Um, you know, yeah, trees are important. I know there's studies out there. Well, deep-rooted grasses too. That especially on buffers. There's a lot of data on buffers that the roots. What most people don't understand is once water enters the soil, and I didn't for a long time. Once water enters the soil, most of the time in our glacially impacted soils, we have restricting layers that hold water up in the soil profile, and water just doesn't move straight down to the water table. Many times it'll hit that restricting layer, and then it'll travel horizontally across the landscape. And that gives opportunity for deep-rooted plants to catch that water and filter it and use it and slow it down and um, and capture some of those nutrients before they can escape. So um, yeah, some of our most rich soils were prairie soils that evolved with grasses and prairie plants. Um, but then we had our oak savannas too, which were really, really rich ecosystems.
Jim, can you talk a little bit about the difference between uh, regen, regenerative agriculture, soil health, and organic? Like, is it possible to raise organic food and still negatively impact water?
Oh yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, I don't know that I don't know that I totally agree with this statement, but I think by and large, um, when the USDA took over the organic certification, it lost some of its original meaning. Um, it turned it into a suite of practices. It turned it into rules and regulations instead of a philosophy. Originally, organic agriculture in the starting back in the 1940s with the word 30s and 40s with the work of Sir Robert Howard and Charles Albrecht and those other guys that were doing research way back in the 40s and 50s on this. Um, it was all about supporting that soil biology and increasing cation exchange capacity and organic matter in your soil and this kind of stuff. And that's the way it evolved through the 60s and the 70s. And now it's got that organic label. So, we're seeing a lot of fraud in the organic industry. I don't know if it's a lot, but we're seeing fraud in the organic industry where people are not correctly documenting what they're doing. And you don't, organic doesn't necessarily, the organic regulations don't necessarily address erosion as such.
Right.
They do. It does call to one of the primary things that is called for in the organic standard is to build soil health, to build soil. Um, Soil health is more of the soil health principles that we talked about. That I went through. And how you build specifically how that soil functions and how it cycles those nutrients and those waters and how you build that water and how you build that system. Regenerative agriculture, that dives into things like agroforestry and silvopasture and some of those different things that are the next step beyond soil health. Soil health is important, but if you look at Mark Shepard's site, I've done key lines on our farm. We have a small 2-acre patch that I put in a key line water capture system 15, 18 years ago. And I've modified that a little bit over years, and we've been building soil within that system for the same period of time. We had that 10-inch rainfall that took out the Duluth Zoo. We got close to 10 inches. I think we were a little under, closer to 9. I could not find evidence that we lost any water off that field. We captured everything that landed there.
Wow.
That's how we restore hydrology. That's how we restore our water quality and the natural systems that are there. Look at Mark Shepard's system. When I first met Mark, he was just starting to see woody. He was just starting to see weedy wetland vegetation at the end of his key lines on these dry ridges. So he started when he first gave his first presentation, he wanted to get out there with his front end loader and dig those out a little bit with a backhoe or something, and kind of create little wetlands up that slope. And a few years later, he was seeing frogs in those ponds that were starting to develop. And in his book, Restoration Agriculture, he talks about he had his first snapping turtles hatch out of one of his ponds. And these are ponds that were built on a degraded agricultural row crop system up until the mid 90s.
It's been really interesting for me to talk to people who are adopting this and buying land or renting land. People like Abe, who kind of came to this late and chosen this. But then there's farmers that I'm talking to, and they're third generation, and they have been doing it since their grandfather's time. It's the way they always farmed, focusing on these soil health principles. It's how they farmed in the 20s after the Dust Bowl 30s. They came in and said, here's how you can protect your soil. And it's kind of like everything old is new again. And I've asked them, and they said, well, my grandfather looked at the cost with buying these chemicals, and the salesman was standing in his yard and saying, well, you can get these chemicals and you get the seeds that are resistant, and it's this whole system. And he said, my grandfather thought, well, he just was waiting. The guy was just waiting for him to get his checkbook out. So he told him to move along. Like, why spend the money? And now here they are kind of all these years later, out ahead of it again. It's just really interesting the way the farming philosophy has shifted back and forth.
Yeah, it's kind of a powerful message when you talk to farmers when you say, well, which side of the check would you like to sign, the front or the back?
Right, right. Uh, Here's a question about invasive species, concern about lakes, any regenerative ag practices that affect the spread of them.
Uh, you have you tend to have more weeds in a regenerative agriculture system, um, but they don't get to be persistent problems like, I don't know if you're familiar with the, oh shoot, what's the amaranth, palmar amaranth that they can't get rid of, and it's become resistant to Roundup now, so they've gone back to using 2,4-D in combination with Roundup to treat that amaranth. Um, I guess you know what Gabe Brown would say: if my cows eat it, it's no longer a weed. Um, I know there's a lot of good work going on with grazing buckthorn and garlic mustard and some of those invasive species, terrestrial invasive species with goats and sheep. They're having pretty good luck with that, mostly in government owned or county or state parks, things like that. Bringing in those goats on a very specific schedule at the right time of the year for the right amount of time to try to control some of that buckthorn and garlic mustard. We have part of our field that we have some problems with tansy that we're working on, and I think after just 1 year, I think we've come quite a ways on knocking some of that back, and using the cows and the sheep to try to control some of that. So yeah, I guess I don't know, invasive species. I just don't. I know they're a problem, but this is about a system. Um, so I think done right, agriculture can help increase. Done right, agriculture can help increase that diversity, and invasive species become less of a problem.
Well, and then in terms of lakes, some invasive species like starry stonewort, they're looking for high quality waters. That's why it's so frightening. It's starry stonewort is an algae that is threatened in its native habitat. And so I called over there and, over in Europe in the Baltic area and said, well, why is it threatened there? And they said, well, because our waters are so degraded. It prefers high quality waters. So it gets here into Minnesota and it's happy as a clam. But a lot of the invasive species, the carps in particular, they depend on degraded systems. They do better in degraded systems. And so when you get things like the algae blooms, which are sucking the oxygen off the top, and there's very little oxygen at the bottom, and these fish species kind of get trapped in these areas, these thermoclines of the lake. Um, that starts to have a big impact. I mean, think of a lake as like a spinning top, and it can take a little bit of abuse, a couple of pokes, but eventually it'll tip. And it's very hard to get it back to what it was. So, by reducing agricultural runoff, by keeping more water on the land, we're going to have and less nitrogen, less phosphorus running into the lakes. The other thing about water that rushes off a landscape into lakes is as the water rushes over the landscape, it picks up temperature. It becomes warm. And so the thermoclines in lakes are a big deal because you end up uh, trapping different layers and you don't get the exchange that you need, and then you start to impact aquatic habitat as well in terms of oxygen, the chemistry of the lake. So uh, I think it would you know at least help mitigate the impacts of AIS. Some species of aquatic invasive species in lakes that were healthier had less runoff, less algae, less nitrogen. And in some cases, it would simply prevent the species from becoming established in the first place because there wouldn't be a niche in a healthy system for them.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I guess I've had those thoughts before. I guess I maybe had misunderstood Jake's question when he asked about invasive species, that maybe he was talking about aquatic invasive species, and not terrestrial. Um, he added another question about what about algae blooms in lake water, and it all comes back to what you were saying about the temperature and the runoff, and when farmers are adding phosphorus to the soil every year, some of that's going to leave, and it's just like the nitrogen. We know that even with the very best technology that we have right now, with GPS guided tractors that are reading satellite imagery and applying the right amount of split application of nitrogen based on what the crop needs at the right time, we're still getting a 30% loss to our groundwater as nitric oxide to our atmosphere. Even with the very best technology we have, we're still losing 30% of that nitrogen to our environment. That's a huge issue that has to be addressed.
Yeah.
And I really think we need cows. We need livestock to do that. They're the driver to get those on the cover crops and get them to. So Ray Archuleta makes the claim that if you put animals at the right stocking density, he says about somewhere around 200,000 to up to 1,000,000 pounds per acre. So that's a cow every 100 square feet. If you put cows in at the right density on the right forage that's a little over mature, so at the right time of the year for the right length of time on a degraded soil, in as little as 20 minutes of animal impact, you can increase organic matter in your soil by 1/2 to 1%. He says he's seen that all over our country, time and time again, on these degraded soils, how fast you can rebuild those with proper stocking density, proper rest, proper return, so you don't bring those animals back too soon. Hitting that forage at the right time and hitting it at the right stocking density and having that desired impact. Yeah, it's
So a lot of my daughter's friends have become vegan because they're concerned about climate change. And now I'm meeting you guys, and you're telling me that we have to have cows or animals on the landscape in order to restore our soils as a way to mitigate climate change. So, what should I tell my children's vegan friends?
there are no vegan ecosystems. There's always a predator-prey relationship.
It's eat or be eaten.
What's that?
It's eat or be eaten.
Right. No, these are natural systems that evolved. I'd encourage him to watch that PowerPoint presentation by Stephen Thomberg or Tomford. I think he does a really good job of laying out why we need animals on our landscapes. Um, These are our most fertile landscapes evolved with grazing ruminants, and lots of them. That's how the prairie soils 6, 8, 12 feet deep were built, is with livestock, with animals, grazing livestock. Well, I guess they weren't livestock technically, but grazing ruminants. Um, yeah, I guess what I challenge my vegan friends with is, how are we going to grow? How are we going to grow the food we need without the biological stimulator of animals? And usually what happens with those that are really dedicated to being a vegan is eventually it comes down with, yeah, Jim, I can't. I'll just say my son-in-law and my niece and her husband are very strict vegans, and they have a lot of disposable income, and they could be spending it on supporting farmers like us that are trying to do the right thing. But finally, after years and years of back and forth, he came to the point where he couldn't argue with me anymore. He's a lawyer too. He couldn't argue with me anymore, and he just admitted that he doesn't eat animals because he doesn't want something to die to feed him. And he
Right.
said plants are going to die, but they don't count, I guess. Um, yeah, it. I don't know how else we grow our food without livestock. And what do we do with all the land that can't grow crops? That is well suited, like most of Pine River watershed, it's well suited to graze animals, but you can't. I mean, it's too sandy or too rocky. You can't row crop that stuff.
I saw a question by Patty Walsh, and it popped up, and now I can't see it. Um, and I'm looking for it. I don't know where it went, Patty.
I don't know where it went either. I don't see it. I see another comment by Caitlin telling you to have your vegan friends seek out indigenous knowledge. A really good conference to go to if you want to know about indigenous farming is the Indigenous Farming Conference over in Monoman. They usually have it in the springtime in March, put on by the White Earth tribe over there. The White Earth Band. They just do a great job. It's really an amazing conference, and it's just a really low key conference, and they really get they're really passionate about seed saving and the genetics behind seeds and how important those living beings are, because they see seed as something precious and alive and part of their heritage and part of their ancestry. It's a pretty amazing conference.
Uh, any other questions or comments?
So where's this going to be posted, Jeff, for folks?
Well, it'll be on our website, www.mnlakesandrivers.org. I'll send, we have any guidance on researching recommended stocking rates of various livestock?
Um, I don't know if I have a. I mean, there's all kinds of information out there. I don't know if I have any. I have a couple publications, but I can't think of them off the top of my head. One is not online, called Grass, the Stockman's Tool. Um, the University of Minnesota has some pretty good research out there. There's pretty good resources out there. The NRCS, of course, your soil and water conservation districts are getting better and better at having that information.
Well, we were hoping to have our annual meeting at the University of Minnesota out by where their research fields are, and we were going to go out and look at it. But that's not possible in these days. So
Right.
doing this instead.
Um, yeah, maybe I can try to attach or add another some resources on that in there. But the Sustainable Farming Association might be a really good resource for you too, Amanda. Go to the Sustainable Farming Association website. They have Sustainable Farming Association has taken a very concerted effort in the last 5 or 10 years to reach out to conventional farmers and try to understand their needs and educate them on the importance of grazing livestock, properly managed livestock, and covers crops and soil health in general. Um, yeah, and we're doing a silvopasture series right now as part of a University of Minnesota research project on oak savanna, specifically oak savanna restoration. But we have a lot of other landscapes that we're highly dependent on grazing livestock, like our pine barrens and the Lake Agassiz area up there had a lot of animal impact historically.
Do you use fire at all in your work, Jim?
Do I get inspired?
Fire.
A fire?
Fire, because the prairies burned a lot. You
Oh,
know, fire
fire.
was.
Yeah, there's a. I actually had it in one of my slides and I took it out. There's a system called burn patch graze, where the way it was described to me was they were doing it down in Missouri on about a 7,000 acre prairie. And this guy had been managing this prairie for most of his career. He was late in his career, and he thought it was a beautiful prairie. And then they started doing this burn patch graze where they would develop paddocks several hundred acres in size, and they would burn these paddocks. And then after they burned them, they would let them come back and start to regrow. And then after they started to regrow, they would introduce livestock. Um, no, I take that back. They would do a several hundred acre paddock, and they would burn about a third of it. And then they would let the animals into the whole paddock. The livestock would spend most of their time grazing the stuff that had been burned because it was the most lush and the most green. And that's where the majority of the impact would be. The next year, they would leave them there for a specific amount of time. They would pull them off. They would bring them back on again. The next year they would burn another third of it, and then bring the animals back. And they would do that for 3 years and rotate through that paddock, doing that burn and patch and then graze. And then they would tear that paddock down and they would move to another whole paddock and do the same thing over and over again. And they've been doing this for about, I think when I heard his presentation, they've been doing it for 6 or 7 years. And he said that the bobwhite quail numbers had exploded. One of the reasons was because bobwhite quail need escape cover, and especially the young chicks need to be able to get out and sun themselves early in the morning when there's dew on the grass. So they didn't have that opportunity before the animal impact. And when the animal impact happened, it opened up cow trails and things like that that they thought were negatives on the animal impact. But it turns out that the wildlife is using that cover um, as escape cover, as dust bathing and things like that those animals need. They evolved with those impacts from buffalo and other grazing ruminants, so they need that type of habitat. So yeah, burn patch graze. There's a lot of research out on that. A lot of getting to be more and more all the time.
That's fascinating. Um, well, so we'll post a copy of this on our website at mnlakesandrivers.org. And please share it widely, however you want to use it, if it's useful. And then look on our website, and in the next week, I imagine, there'll be a section dedicated to this Up the Creek meets CSA, which is basically just our pilot to connect lake associations with farmers like Jim. And how it works is you reach out to your members and say, okay, here are the products available. Get your orders in, and then place your order all at once, and work out some sort of delivery. Maybe the farmer can deliver it to an annual meeting or some other kind of meeting and give a presentation like Jim has done. Maybe the members of the Lake Association want to go out to the farm. And every farmer I've spoken with has said, please come out. They want people out there. At the Linda, what is the date on the ACL membership meeting? This is being done in partnership with the Association of Cass County Lakes. And I think that date on that meeting was the 29th, but correct me if I'm wrong, Linda. Yeah, Friday, May 29th at the Hub, which is in Outing, Minnesota. And Ron Meyer, who's been working, Hackensack, you're right, Linda. So that meeting of the Association of Cass County Lakes is Friday, May 29th at the Hub in Hackensack, Minnesota. Ron Meyer, who's been doing some of this work with Pine River Watershed Alliance and the Whitefish Area Property Owners Association. They have a harvest dinner every year on a farm, and they're going to give a presentation on some of that work that they're doing, and we're going to try and roll this program out at that meeting. So that's a good opportunity to sort of get into how to make this happen. And what can you do? Buy your meat from farmers. Know who you're buying your meat from and how they raise it. My story is I'm a hunter and a fisherman and all that, and I've always eaten meat. And I married a woman who was a committed vegetarian. And I met Abe through Ron and Jim, and started buying my meat from Abe and started telling the story. And now my wife eats hamburgers for the first time. We've been married 30 years, and she's oh, this is so good, and she feels good about what she's eating because she knows that it's good for her, it's good for the environment, it's good for the farmer, it's good for small communities, it's good. If you're interested in attending and not on the ACL email list, you can contact Linda Blake, who is the president of ACL, and she is a remarkable person. And her email is blake@umn.edu, and she can send you the information on the meeting. And I think that's all. Jim, anything to add?
No, I don't think I have anything to add. I've probably talked enough.
Well, thank you for doing this for us, Jim. I
Yeah,
know this is not easy.
yeah, wasn't too painful.
And sorry for the technical difficulties, but we got through it.
Yeah, we did. All right, thanks everybody.
That's Caitlin. Thank you, and have a good evening, afternoon, and be well, be safe, be healthy. Thank you.
Be healthy, everybody. Yep. Thanks, Jeff. Take care.
You too, Jim. I'm grateful.